911, what's your emergency?
He fell. There's so much blood. The bear is still there. Please send help.
Move to a safe distance, stay on the road, and keep eyes on the pull-off near McDonald Lake. Help is on the way.
That call would mark the beginning of one of Glacier National Park's most tragic mornings. A routine bike ride along the quiet, fog-covered Going to the Sun road turned into a fight against nature's raw power. Within minutes, a life was lost, a family was changed forever, and a community was left asking how a place so breathtaking could also be so unforgiving. This is the real story of what happened on that August morning, what led to it, and why it could happen again. If stories like this move you, please like, share, and subscribe so we can keep bringing you more real accounts that matter. The morning of August 3rd, 2025, began with the kind of stillness that only Glacier National Park could hold. The air carried the lingering chill of the mountain night, cool enough to sting the skin, but fresh in a way that made each breath feel alive. A thin veil of mist clung to the towering pines, softening their edges and catching the pale gold light of the rising sun. The scent of damp earth and pine needles drifted lazily on the breeze, mixing with the faint sound of water somewhere far off. Andrew Miller, 42, had started his ride the way he always did. His navy windbreaker caught the faint shimmer of sunlight as he pedaled along Going to the Sun road, the quiet stretch of pavement that had become his morning ritual. The road wound through the heart of the park, curving gently between dense forest on one side and sweeping views of the mountains on the other. The rhythmic click of the chain and the steady hum of his tires filled the silence, blending with the distant chatter of birds waking in the treetops. It was a morning for moving slowly, for letting the park reveal itself one curve at a time. The crisp air carried the faint tang of lake water as he approached a bend near McDonald Lake. His breaths were even, his thoughts quiet, his body moving almost on autopilot, just another morning ride before the day's responsibilities began. Not far behind, Sarah Whitmore stood with her camera perched on a tripod, framing the perfect shot of the sun spilling over the ridge. At 29, she was no stranger to the park's beauty, but this morning's light felt special, as if the world had paused to let her capture it. She adjusted her focus, unaware that her attention was about to be pulled somewhere entirely different. From within the trees, there came a sound sharp, dry, and sudden. It cut through the quiet like the crack of a branch under heavy weight. Andrew's head turned instinctively toward the noise, his hands tightening on the handlebars. The mist in the air seemed to shift, the forest holding its breath. Sarah's lens drifted from the mountains toward the road below. Her eyes widened, her body locking in place. Without thinking, she reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed. The park's peace was broken now, the air filled with her hurried voice to the 911 operator. Her words spilled out in gasps, trying to explain the location near McDonald Lake, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. In the space of moments, the quiet morning had turned into something no one there would ever forget. The sharp wail of the alarm echoed through the Glacier Ranger Station, cutting into the early morning calm. Within seconds, 3 rangers and a park medic were on the move, pulling on jackets and grabbing their gear. The call from dispatch was brief but urgent, an incident near McDonald Lake, possible wildlife involvement. They piled into the park's all-terrain vehicle, the engine rumbling to life before the last door had even shut. The road ahead was swallowed by a thick blanket of fog. Headlights sliced narrow tunnels through the mist, revealing only fragments of the winding pavement before it disappeared again. The forest on either side loomed like a shadow, its edges softened by the haze. Inside the vehicle, no one spoke. The hum of the tires and the steady thump of the engine filled the silence, every bump in the road reminding them how far they still had to go. Meanwhile, Sarah still had the phone pressed to her ear. Her voice was thin, almost breaking as she tried to keep it steady. He fell. There's so much blood. The bear is still here. The dispatcher's tone was calm but firm, urging her to move to a safe distance, to keep her eyes on the scene from afar. Sarah's breath came in quick bursts, each one caught by the wind, rushing across the open stretch where she stood. The rescue team made the final turn toward the lake. The fog shifted just enough to reveal a lone bicycle lying on its side, its frame twisted out of shape. Nearby, a torn backpack lay open, its contents scattered across the damp roadside. The air was heavy with the scent of wet earth and something sharper, metallic. Andrew lay a few feet away, motionless. The bright colors of his jacket were darkened and torn, revealing deep marks that cut through fabric and flesh. The bear was gone, but its presence lingered in the form of massive paw prints pressed into the wet ground, leading back toward the trees. One ranger knelt beside Andrew, gloved hands searching for a pulse. The medic stood ready, watching for any sign of movement. A quiet shake of the ranger's head was all it took for the rest of the team to understand. No one said a word. Around them, the park remained still. The fog drifted in slow waves, muffling every sound. The forest didn't move. The water of the lake lay flat and dark, and even the birds seemed to have fallen silent. In that moment, the absence of noise felt heavier than any roar or scream could have. Andrew's body arrived at the Kalispell Medical Center under a pale, overcast sky. The building was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt heavier inside its walls. In the examination room, the overhead lights cast a stark glow on the stainless steel table where he lay. Dr. Elaine Porter, a seasoned forensic pathologist with years of experience, stood beside him, her expression focused and unflinching. She moved with measured precision, documenting every detail with care. Her eyes paused on the deep gashes across his chest, 3 long, parallel marks that reached down to the ribcage. She traced their path without touching, noting their depth in her report, at his neck. The wound was unmistakable, a single, crushing bite that had severed the carotid artery. Each mark told the same story, and it was not a story of hesitation. Dr. Porter's pen moved steadily, her handwriting neat despite the weight of the moment. Investigator Mark Holden stood nearby, watching closely. His hands rested in his pockets, his shoulders tense. The preliminary findings aligned with what he already suspected: massive blood loss and catastrophic trauma to the chest and neck, consistent with a direct, aggressive strike from a full-grown grizzly bear. Even knowing the facts didn't make them easier to hear. Out in the hallway, the air felt colder. Andrew's wife sat in one of the rigid chairs, her hands tightly clasped around those of their 10-year-old son. Her eyes were swollen, her face pale, her gaze fixed on the floor as though looking anywhere else would make it real. The boy's voice was barely above a whisper when he asked, "Mom, why would a bear do that?" No one answered. The question hung there, fragile and unanswered, the silence heavier than any explanation could be. When Mark finally stepped into the hallway, the sound of his shoes against the tile was enough to make them both look up. He spoke quietly, his words deliberate, delivering the confirmation they dreaded. The room seemed to shrink with each sentence, and then came the sound he had been expecting, but still dreaded: the sharp, breaking sob of a woman who had just heard the truth in its final form. Through the tall window at the end of the corridor, the old pines outside swayed gently in the wind. They stood as they always had, unmoved, indifferent. Nature was still moving forward, even as one family's world had stopped. The following morning, the air in Glacier National Park carried a damp chill, the kind that clung to clothing and skin. A thin mist lingered between the trees as investigator Mark Holden and wildlife biologist Dr. Lucas Grant made their way back to the scene. The forest was quiet, except for the muted crunch of their boots against the soft earth. Mark moved steadily, scanning the ground ahead, while Lucas examined the edges of the trail with a practiced eye. It didn't take long to find what they were looking for: deep, defined paw prints pressed into the wet soil, each one spaced with the heavy stride of a large animal. The impressions were fresh, pointing back toward the denser parts of the forest. Nearby, several tree stumps stood scarred, long, raw grooves cut deep into the wood, signs of a bear sharpening its claws or marking territory. Lucas crouched low, brushing his gloved hand over a patch of bare ground where the soil had been disturbed. "This area used to have plenty of berries," he said, his voice measured. "Now it's dry. Could be from the drought this year, and with the logging at the park's edges, food sources are shrinking." Mark listened in silence, his eyes following the faint trail that disappeared into the undergrowth. The reality of the situation settled heavier with each step they took. Further along the path, they came across scattered bits of plastic and foil remnants of trash left behind by visitors. The edges were torn and crumpled, some marked with the unmistakable signs of animal teeth. Lucas straightened up, shaking his head. Once they learn they can find food here, they'll keep coming back. It's not just survival, it's habit now. By the time they returned to the ranger station, the clouds had thickened, dimming the afternoon light. A small group of reporters waited outside, their cameras and microphones ready. Inside, Lucas addressed them directly. His explanation was calm, but firm. While grizzly attacks on humans were rare, the pressures on the bear's habitat meant encounters were becoming more likely. If their living space keeps shrinking, he warned, so will the distance between them and us. His words spread quickly, stirring debate. Some voices called for stricter protections for park visitors, more patrols, more restrictions, maybe even removal of aggressive animals. Others argued for stronger environmental protections to stop the root cause before it escalated. The conversation was already drawing lines between safety and conservation, each side convinced of its urgency. That evening, as night settled over the park, McDonald Lake reflected the black silhouette of the mountains. The water lay still, unbroken, but the image it held was a reminder nature was never entirely under human control. 3 days later, Kalispell woke to a sky the color of slate. A light drizzle had been falling since dawn, soft enough to blur the edges of the mountains in the distance. Outside the small church on Main Street, rows of folding chairs were set beneath a canopy, though the rain still found its way in, dripping steadily onto the ground. Locals gathered quietly, their umbrellas forming a dark, uneven patchwork against the gray. The slow toll of the church bell carried through the damp air, each chime lingering before fading into the low murmur of the crowd. Inside, the scent of polished wood and candle wax was heavy, wrapping itself around the somber faces of those who had come to say goodbye. At the front, Andrew's wife sat with a framed photo resting in her lap. The picture showed him smiling, his eyes bright, captured in a moment that now felt impossibly distant. Her own eyes were swollen and rimmed red, the weight of the past days etched into every line of her expression. Beside her stood their 10-year-old son, small hands gripping the edge of her coat. He didn't look at the people who passed by to offer quiet condolences. Instead, his gaze stayed fixed on the dark wooden casket at the center of the room. Every so often, his fingers tightened their hold, as if to make sure she didn't slip away too. When it was time for family to speak, Andrew's older brother stepped forward. His voice wavered at first, but he steadied it enough to be heard clearly. "We can't let this keep happening," he said, scanning the faces before him. "If we don't protect the places these animals live, more families will face the kind of pain we're feeling now." His words were plain, but the raw truth in them needed no embellishment. Heads nodded in quiet agreement, some eyes welling with tears. At the back of the gathering, a small group of environmental advocates stood together. Their banners were rolled at their sides, the rain having blurred the ink on their hand-painted messages. They didn't speak. They simply bowed their heads, sharing in the grief while holding on to the cause that had brought them there. As the service ended, the rain grew heavier, dotting the surface of the casket as it was carried outside. The drops clung to the photo in Andrew's wife's hands, streaking across his face in a way that looked almost like tears. The sound of rain replaced the murmur of voices, falling over the crowd until it became the only thing anyone could hear. It felt, for a moment, as though the sky itself had joined in mourning the life lost too soon. Not long after Andrew's funeral, the conference room at Glacier National Park's headquarters filled with a mix of uniforms, business attire, and worn flannel jackets. The air felt thick, not from the summer heat outside, but from the weight of what everyone had come to discuss. Around the long table sat park rangers, local officials, wildlife biologists, and representatives from environmental groups. Each carried a different stake in the park's future, and all were aware that whatever decisions were made here would leave a mark. The meeting began with the head ranger outlining a set of proposed safety measures, more warning signs posted along high-risk trails. new restrictions on early morning cycling, and seasonal closures of certain routes during peak foraging times. His voice was steady but carried the urgency of someone who had seen too much loss. Before he could finish, a representative from a conservation group leaned forward, her tone sharp but controlled. "Limiting people is one thing," she said, "but talk of removing or euthanizing bears is unacceptable. They're doing what they've always done, surviving. It's us who have moved into their space." Several others murmured their agreement, their frustration with human encroachment clear. Dr. Lucas Grant, seated near the center, spoke next. His words came with the calm certainty of years in the field. "If we don't protect their habitat corridors," he explained, "encounters like this will continue. You can fence off trails, you can change visitor schedules, but without space and food, the bears will keep coming closer." His gaze moved deliberately around the room, letting the message settle. Across from him, a tourism board representative cleared his throat. "I understand the science," he began, "but heavy restrictions will hit the local economy hard. Fewer visitors mean fewer jobs, fewer bookings, and less revenue for the communities around this park. We can't ignore that reality." His words drew nods from some and frowns from others, the divide becoming sharper. The discussion swelled, voices overlapping as perspectives clashed. Safety, ecology, and economics pulled against each other in a way that offered no easy compromise. Some spoke about responsibility to protect human life at all costs. Others argued for preserving the park's role as a sanctuary for wildlife above all else. Then, in the middle of the back and forth, a ranger stepped into the room, rain still clinging to his jacket. His voice cut through the noise without effort. "We've just spotted a large grizzly near McDonald Lake," he announced. "It matches the description of the bear involved in the attack on Andrew." The room fell silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the overhead lights. Whatever debates had been taking place moments earlier now hung in suspension, replaced by the heavy realization that the conversation had just shifted from theory to something far more immediate. The ranger team moved quickly, but without haste, their vehicles navigating the wet, narrow road toward McDonald Lake. The rain had been falling since early morning, leaving the pavement slick and the air heavy with the scent of wet pine. Dr. Lucas Grant sat in the passenger seat, his gaze fixed ahead, mentally cataloging what they might find. Investigator Mark Holden followed in another vehicle, his notebook already resting on the seat beside him. When they reached the pull-off near a scenic rest area, the scene came into view. A massive grizzly stood with its head buried in a public trash bin, the metal lid clanging faintly with each movement. Its fur was soaked through, the deep brown nearly black in the rain. Droplets slid from its coat in rivulets, pooling in the mud at its feet. Even from a distance, there was a sharpness in its eyes, alert, calculating, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Lucas raised his binoculars and studied the animal in silence. After a moment, he lowered them slightly, noting the uneven rhythm of its steps. "It's limping," he said quietly. "Probably an old injury, maybe from another bear or even a run-in with human activity. Bears like this, especially when injured or struggling to find food, are more likely to take risks." His tone was factual, but there was an undercurrent of concern. Mark wrote quickly, capturing each detail. Still, his thoughts circled back to the same question: was this bear simply following instinct? Or had it learned that human areas meant easy meals, blurring the line between wild and dependent? The answer could change everything about how the park approached the situation. The team discussed moving the bear into a controlled area where it could be tranquilized, examined, and fitted with a tracking collar. The plan was deliberate, avoiding unnecessary stress for the animal. But as they shifted into position, the bear's head snapped up. Its ears pivoted forward, and for a long moment, it simply stared at them through the rain. Then, without warning, it let out a low, resonant growl. The sound carried over the patter of rain, deep and unmistakable. It turned sharply and moved with surprising speed toward the tree line, disappearing into the dense cover before anyone could react. The only trace left behind was the churned mud around the bin and the sound of rain falling harder against the leaves. Mark stood still for a moment, the rain cold against his face, the notepad limp in his hand. The bear was gone. But the questions it left behind were heavier than before. The truth of what happened to Andrew felt close enough to touch, yet just out of reach, and the pressure to find it pressed harder than the storm above them. 1 week after the attack, the findings were ready. The press gathered in the modest conference room at Glacier National Park's headquarters, their cameras and microphones lined up in quiet anticipation. Outside, the clouds hung low over the mountains, their weight pressing down on the day. Mark Holden stood off to the side, his arms folded as Dr. Lucas Grant stepped to the podium. The air felt still, the kind of stillness that comes before words people know they won't forget. Lucas began with the facts. DNA traces found on Andrew's clothing matched samples collected from bear hair near the attack site and from the area where the large grizzly had been spotted days later. The conclusion was certain it was the same animal, but his voice softened as he continued. "This was a predatory encounter," he said, pausing briefly. "But the deeper cause lies in the changes to the bear's habitat." He clicked to the next slide, a series of satellite images showing the park's western forests over the past decade. The green receded year by year, replaced by pale scars of cleared land. Illegal logging, paired with drought conditions, has stripped away food sources and disrupted migration paths. The bears are adapting the only way they can, by moving into human spaces. At the front row, Andrew's wife sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had been silent through most of the briefing, but when the floor opened for questions, she stood. Her voice was steady at first, but it wavered as she spoke. "If the forest had still been there," she said, looking directly at the cameras, "my husband might still be alive." The room went still. Reporters, rangers, and officials all seemed to pause in unison. Her words carried no accusation, only the undeniable truth that linked the loss of one life to the loss of an entire ecosystem. Mark glanced around the room. In the faces around him, he saw the same realization forming that the divide between human safety and wildlife survival wasn't a chasm, but a thin, shifting line. Push it too far in one direction, and it could vanish altogether. As the conference ended, the reporters filed out, the sound of their footsteps fading into the hallway. Outside, the mountains stood unchanged in their distance, the trees swaying lightly in the wind. But to those who had listened, the view now carried a different weight. Andrew's story would remain in the park's records as another fatal encounter with wildlife. But for those who heard it, it had become something more, a warning that protecting the wilderness was never just about the animals. It was about protecting the space where both worlds could coexist, before the fragile line between them disappeared completely. Andrew's death was not just the result of a bear attack, it was the outcome of a deeper imbalance between humans and the wild. The investigation made it clear shrinking forests, disappearing food sources, and human encroachment had pushed the boundaries until they overlapped. When that happens, tragedy isn't a matter of if, but when. What happened in Glacier National Park is a reminder that preserving wildlife isn't simply about protecting animals. It's about creating a safe distance where both we and they can survive. Every tree cut down, every trail expanded, every piece of trash left behind chips away at that fragile balance. And once it's gone, it's nearly impossible to bring back. Andrew's story should push us to think differently about the spaces we share with nature, because protecting their home, in the end, protects ours too. If you believe stories like this need to be told, please like, share, and subscribe so we can keep bringing real stories that matter